Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Gunther. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Portland Art Museum, and I would like to welcome you to the second lecture in a series the museum is sponsoring around our landmark exhibition, Venice, the Golden Age of Art and Music. My pleasure today is to introduce Dr. Dawson Carr, our Curator of European Art. But before I do that, I would like to remind you of the third lecture in the series, March 30th. Dr. Wendy Heller of Princeton University will be discussing Venice's soundtrack, a modern way of thinking about the role of music in La Serenissima and its impact on this exhibition. She is a world authority and a lively speaker, and I encourage you to put March 30th on your calendar. Yesterday was a sold-out performance of Vivaldi's Four Seasons here at the museum on this stage, and with players from the Oregon Symphony, a great collaboration that's going on. The next major ticketed event in the music of Venice will be with Capella Romana and the Portland Baroque Orchestra, March 22nd in the Crydell Ballroom. There are still some seats left, and I encourage you to consider joining us that evening for the Venetian Baroque, Venice to Moscow, a great program that has been put together by our colleagues and collaborators at Capella Romana. Today I am pleased to introduce Dawson Carr, the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art. It is something of an anniversary. He joined our staff a year ago and began immersing himself not only in our community, our collection, but in the art of Venice as seen by a colleague in Montreal. And Dawson has brought his wit, his intelligence, and his background as a scholar of Spanish and later Italian painting to bear on this exhibition, which I hope all of you have seen and will see a number of times. It keeps giving you new ways of understanding something that seems so familiar and so special. Venice and its city, its cityscape, and its music and art. Through his labels, his work with the Education Department on an audio tour that has not one but two channels. For the obsessive among us, I count myself, you will hear Dawson's voice and a dozen people in our community talking about, in a dialogue about the art, the music, the instruments of this exhibition. The second track is the full playing of the music that is excerpted inside the audio tour. And this is something that Dawson felt very strongly about, and we were thrilled to make happen. It's a great and vibrant tour. It's a great second visit and third visit kind of accompaniment. Dr. Carr received his master's and Ph.D. from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, a distinguished academic community at which he excelled. He was, for 11 years, a curator of painting at the J. Paul Getty Museum of Art, and for a decade just prior to his appointment in Portland at the National Gallery in London. He oversaw major exhibitions and wrote a number of articles, both for periodicals like Burlington and for the National Gallery's publications. He has, since his arrival, rethought our collection and our collection direction, and has given clarity and power to an exhibition that covers 350 years of the most fabled city in Europe, Venice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carr to the stage.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Bruce. I'd like to begin by thanking Janet and Dick Geary, the lead sponsors of this exhibition, and the many others, many of whom I see looking back at me this afternoon, who contributed and made it possible for us to bring this wonderful exhibition to Portland. My purpose this afternoon is really very simple. I thought the host curator ought to address some of the most special objects in the exhibition, and I'm really going to concentrate on just three of them, three works by Canaletto depicting Venetian civic festivals. And I want to give these some context for you. This view of the Church of Santa Maria della Salute in Venice was made by Bruce Gunther on his iPhone during last year's Biennale. And in an age in which virtually anyone can take a photograph on their telephone, it's somewhat difficult for us to appreciate fully the significance of view paintings for Europeans of the late 17th and 18th century. This was the period when most view paintings were produced, and this phenomenon reflects the fundamental Enlightenment principle of empiricism, the attainment of knowledge through direct sensory experience. There you see the same church by Canaletto in this very early work by the artist in the Houston Museum of Art. Just as Canaletto was becoming recognizable as the painter we would know. This is the late 1720s. And a decade later, he had developed this crystalline style that made him famous and indeed the very greatest of all view painters of Venice. Now, view paintings are essentially mimetic and offer a seemingly accurate depiction of a place realized through acute observation and the application of the laws of perspective. This quasi-scientific nature is but one element in their popularity during this period, for their real success depended far more on a burgeoning tourist market. The Grand Tour became an essential part of the education of young gentlemen, and occasionally ladies as well. It provided what we seek in travel, that is, the experience of other cultures. And on the most basic level, images like this were souvenirs, offering a means for tourists to take the visual experience of Venice back home with them. This painting was commissioned while the 4th Earl of Carlisle was on his grand tour from Canaletto. It's about 7 feet wide, and it's in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston today. Luckily, it was sold by the Carlyles the year before the disastrous fire at Castle Howard when it would have burned up. View painting was not invented in Venice, nor in Italy, but rather developed from Northern European and particularly Dutch city views, epitomized by Vermeer's great view of his native Delft, painted in 1660 and 61. Pictures like this purport to show what you see, but indeed, there is a good deal of rearrangement, a good deal of adjustment of actuality to create a brilliant composition. Just as in Canaletto's composition, for those of you who know Venice very well, you know that there it is, that you know that San Giorgio Maggiore doesn't sit quite at that angle, but is more angled back toward the civic center at left. But Canaletto has created this view knowing it was going to be off in England, they'd never remember, and he's created a wonderful composition. We credit Gaspar van Wittel, who was born in Amersfoort, which is near Utrecht, and traveled to Italy, where he became known as Van Vitelli, with being the first significant artist to apply the principles of Northern European view painting to Venice. He comes down, he settles in Rome, he sees Italy and experiences Italy and decides never to return home to the dark north again. And This is the first signed and dated view of the city from 1697, and they show his skills as a draftsman, his mastery of perspective, and his instinct for striking compositions, as well as a meticulous technique. This type of painting was very quickly taken up by a Venetian artist, Luca Carlavaris. Carlavaris is born up the road in Udine, but settles as a boy in Venice, and as far as we know, he's one of the few view painters who didn't have an itinerant career. He really remained in Venice, and you'll recognize this painting in the exhibition from our friends up the road in Seattle. It became one of the most popular views because it shows the two great monuments, the Doge's Palace and the entrance to the Grand Canal with Santa Maria della Salute beyond. Carlavaris, by 1703, when he publishes Le Fabbriche Vedute di Venezia, which is a series of 103 engravings of the city, he really establishes the basic viewpoints of all the great scenes. We have it open to this page in the Ospedale section upstairs. Back to the painting in Seattle, because I want you to get this in your head and watch what Carlavaris does with it for a special purpose. This is his painting of the arrival of the British ambassador, the 4th Earl of Manchester, at the Doge's Palace in 1707. And it's Birmingham, in the Midlands of England, that is. And it shows he's just adapted this, created this grand procession with the Earl right there, barely able to make him out in this slide. Then, once Carlavaris does this work for one ambassador, of course, they all have to have one. And so there are many of them. And I'll show you what Canaletto does with this basic composition 20 years later. This is a vast canvas, almost 9 feet wide, showing the reception of the French ambassador at the Doge's Palace. And you see, Canaletto pulls way back, gives us that sweeping facade. He's the real master of this sort of composition. Carlavaris always favored these very long, narrow formats, and he's really unique among the view painters for that. By the time these ambassadors were experiencing this great reception into Venice, these were planned, usually took place about a year after their real arrival, they certainly understood that they were rather empty displays, that the Serenissima was no longer a great European power. We return to this site before the Doge's Palace for the painting of the greatest day of the year in Venice, the Festa della Sensa. Sensa is the word that in Venetian dialect for Ascension Day in Venice. And this is the marvelous painting of the Bucintoro, the great ship of state, moored at the Molo, the quay at the Doge's Palace, painted by Canaletto in 1745 from the Philadelphia Museum. The Feast of the Ascension of Christ was 40 days after Easter, and Ascension season ran from May into June and was really the culmination of the theater and opera season in Venice. It is the festival most depicted by Canaletto, and as you can see, Venetians in great numbers came out in their boats to accompany the Bucintoro out into the Adriatic for the ceremony in which Venice is wed to the sea. Tourists would rearrange their itinerary so that they could be present to witness this spectacle and admire the vast Bucintoro, which was the pinnacle of Venetian shipbuilding and decoration. View paintings of this scene tend to encompass a broad panorama of the bay filled with boats, and the Bucintoro either moored as it is here at the Doge's palace or in the process of departing for or arriving back from the ceremony. Often one searches in vain for an image of the Doge, because the main point of the event and its imagery was the extent of the civic manifestation of pride in their city. In this case, we can see the Doge under his ceremonial umbrella there, but often he is lost. The ceremony began about the year 1000 to commemorate Doge Pietro II Orseolo's conquest of Dalmatia. He had set out on the expedition on Ascension Day, and thus the ceremony was fixed on that day. In its earliest times, it was a much, much simpler affair than it became. A procession of boats led by the Doge set out to the Lido port, where a prayer of placation was offered. For us and all that sail thereon, may the sea be calm and quiet. It was events in 1177 that established the nuptial aspect of the event. Pope Alexander III was fleeing Frederick Barbarossa and was given refuge in Venice by Doge Sebastiano Ziani, who then presided over a peace treaty between the two. In gratitude, the Pope granted Venice lordship of the Adriatic, symbolized by a gold wedding ring, to marry the sea in a sign of perpetual dominion. Of course, Venice had overcome the sea by its very existence, rising majestically from the water, this great mighty city. But this also implied that Venice owned the sea routes in the Adriatic, and by extension, the right to govern those lands lapped by the sea. By the time Canaletto paints this, those territories were gone. And I told you, in Venetian dialect, it is called the Festa della Sensa, Sensa, contraction of Ascensione. And in the 18th century, there was a pun on this. La Festa della Sensa è senza sensa, is without sense. It was still, as we know from our own experience and our own national holidays, a way in which we bond together and which we come together and celebrate communal values. It was not to last all that much longer. Now, Canaletto did not invent this. Indeed, it was Carl Avaris who does it. This is a painting about 7 feet wide in the Getty Museum, and it was painted in about 1711, showing an earlier version of the Bucintoro. The first Bucintoro was launched in 1311, and Carl Avaris here depicts the third vessel of this kind, launched in 1606, and so by the time of Canaletto, it had already given a century of service. This was the last of the great state galleys that served this role. It was launched on Ascension Day in 1729 in the reign of Alvise III Moncenigo, and it was by far the most sumptuous ever. 115 feet long, over 26 feet off the water. It was indeed a floating palace on 2 levels. Above, the main salon, with the Doge's throne in the stern, could seat 90. It was covered in red velvet and had a richly gilded canopy. The vessel was propelled by 168 oarsmen in teams of 4 on each of its 42 oars. They were about 35 feet long. And it took an additional 40 sailors to maneuver the ship. The oarsmen were not slaves or prisoners. Rather, it was a great honor to be chosen to row the Bucintoro, and one had to be either very strong or very handsome, and preferably both, because you were representing the Republic once you were off the ship. The structure of the Bucintoro reflects the tripartite division of the Venetian state: the Doge, the Senate riding on top, and the people, represented by the oarsmen, literally propelling the ship of state. The Bucintoro also represents one of the reasons that Venice no longer dominated maritime trade in the region. The galleys of Venice, that is, rowed vessels that had served them so well for so very long, dominating the whole of the Mediterranean, were not suited to the great oceanic voyages. And so, once Vasco da Gama discovers the passage to India around the Cape of Good Hope, and America is discovered by Europeans, Venice is just simply left behind. Unfortunately, this great ship only survives in fragments of decoration because it was destroyed on the orders of Napoleon when he took the city in 1797. It represented the old regime, and its destruction was on one hand symbolic, but French troops are reported to have needed some 400 mules to carry the gold away. I'm going to show the ship to you in this model made in 1824 in the Museo Storico Navale in Venice, over near the Arsenal. On the prow was the personification of justice, and indeed this becomes not just a personification of justice, but a personification of Venice herself. As you can see, she's wearing a doge's crown and is under the kind of umbrella carried over the Doge. Venetian justice was one of the fundamental aspects that ensured the success of the Republic, and it was guaranteed to all citizens, not just its nobles. The ship was designed by Michele Stefano Conti, the headmaster of the ship's carpenters, and the decoration was entrusted to the sculptor Antonio Corradini. There you see it from the stern. This is one of the very, very few fragments that remain. Someone must have made off with it as Napoleon's troops were breaking up the ship, and it's in the Museo Carrere today. I wanted to briefly show you, chances are this little piece isn't by Corradini himself, but I think some of you will at least remember who Corradini is, because he became famous in Europe. You see representations of these veiled women all over the place. They were wildly popular. The one on the right is in the Carrozzonico in Venice, and the one on the left is in the Louvre. The ceremony would begin with the Doge and Senate processing from the Doge's palace and boarding the Bucintoro, as you see in the Philadelphia painting. The Bucintoro would then depart the Molo and swing around so that the crowds on the shores could see it. This is a drawing by Canaletto done in the last decade of his life for a series of prints that were made of festivals of the Doge. This is another one of these drawings. The ship would proceed out to the mouth of the Adriatic by the Lido, where the ceremony would take place. The Doge would toss a gold wedding ring into the sea and declare Venice's perpetual dominion over it. And then they would proceed on the Bucintoro to the church of San Nicolo al Lido. This is a church dedicated to St. Nicholas of Myra, the saint, the patron saint of those who sail on the seas. At San Nicolo, they would hear Mass, attend a banquet, and then make their way back to the Molo. This is the painting by Canaletto, done about 15 years after the Philadelphia painting, this one in the Dulwich Picture Gallery just outside London. And it gives us a chance to see that Canaletto's art was not static. It developed in time. And the bright, sunny, clear picture in Philadelphia later in Canaletto's years, takes on a kind of moody atmosphere, and one in which the atmosphere of Venice, the thick, humid atmosphere, plays a role, breaking up the specular highlights on the vessel. Canaletto depicts this scene from all kinds of angles. This one, very close to the Philadelphia piece, is in the collection of the Royal Collection in Britain. It's one of the pictures painted for the British consul in Venice, Joseph Smith, who was hugely responsible for launching Canaletto's career and making him popular with the British. This was one of a cache of paintings that was sold to George III. Another much larger example in the National Gallery in London, showing the throngs lining the Molo, and taking over that view, once again taking in the entrance to the Grand Canal as well, painted for a grand tourist. The ceremony continues today, albeit in a much reduced form. The Bisona Serenissima that you see in the lower left corner now fills the role, and the mayor of the city stands in for the Doge. There it is. But there is a plan afoot. Beginning in 2008, a foundation was created, a private foundation, to recreate the last Bucintoro, and they just need about 20 million euros to realize it. They have begun. It, of course, keeps stopping as money runs out. And in 2008, we roared with laughter when we read in the papers in London that the foundation had written to President Nicolas Sarkozy of France, suggesting that he make a major donation to make up for Napoleon's vandalism. Now, you can imagine in 2008, in the midst of financial meltdown, what the reaction was in the Élysée Palace. We can only hope. It would be stupendous if they realize it. But they've chosen a very, very bad time. I'm taking you back now to the Getty Carlavaris showing this scene to make a point. The two paintings of the Bucintoro at the Molo in the exhibition were created as individual pieces, at least as far as we know. But this scene was very regularly paired with another quintessentially Venetian scene by all of the Venetian view painters. And this one, you see it on top here, was paired with this depiction of a regatta. In this case, it is a very specific regatta. It depicts an event in 1709 in which Frederick IV of Denmark, who you see right there, was celebrated in Venice with this regatta. Regattas would often begin with a great parade of decorated boats. This is the spot from which all regatta views are taken. It's right at a bend in the Grand Canal. The view is taken from the windows of the Palazzo Foscari. The Palazzo Balbi is there. And just here you see what was called the Macchina della Regatta, a temporary structure that marked the starting point and the finish line of the race. The races would go down the Grand Canal and return. There is the Queen's painting of Ascension Day and its pair, this regatta scene, individual gondola races being held here. There were all sorts of classes, 2-man, 4-man, 8-man. There was a class for young people and for women as well. And finally, I show you again the National Gallery Ascension Day picture paired with a regatta. I could go on and on. Regattas are still a feature of Venetian life, and the gondoliers and oarsmen of the city take them very seriously. But some of the regattas have taken on a distinctly non-Venetian character, as you see in this picture. I think that's our fault. The feast day of St. Roche from the National Gallery in London is distinct among Canaletto's depictions of state occasions. He painted the subject only once, and it is one of his largest depictions of such scenes. And for that reason, and because it anchors a wall in a very great room at the National Gallery, it is very rarely lent. Most significantly, in this painting, we can see unusually large figures for the artist, and this affords a privileged view of a demonstration of public piety in honor of a patron saint of the Republic. When we come to this scene, I have to take a step back to consider view painting in general, because Venice had long served as a background for such scenes. This is Gentile Bellini painting a procession of the confraternity, the Scuola of San Giovanni Evangelista in the Piazza San Marco. We couldn't bring this one for you to see. It's about 25 feet wide. And in the Accademia today, as you can see, they're processing with one of their great relics, a fragment of the True Cross. And in point of fact, this is really a narrative painting, because the man kneeling here kneels and prays as the image passes that his son's life be spared. His son is at home gravely ill, and when he returns home, the son is miraculously healed. It was painted for the grand entrance hall of the Scuola di San Giovanni Evangelista. Canaletto, of course, applies much more up-to-date principles of perspective and the like in the creation of this scene, but essentially we're dealing with the same sort of image. However, nothing nearly so specific, not really narrative, and as near as we can tell, not meaning to portray one year's ceremony, but rather this great annual event. Canaletto's work depicts the solemn visitation made each August the 16th, the feast day of St. Roche. Roche is Rocco in Italian, by the Doge and his entourage to the church of San Rocco, where the saint's remains are revered. The Doge would arrive in his state barge and be greeted by the governors of the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, one of the most powerful and wealthy lay confraternities, the seat of which dominates Canaletto's composition. The dignitaries would first hear Mass in the church, venerate the saint's relics, and then attend a reception in the Scuola behind. This is the Sala Superiore, one of the grand halls. There are two on two floors, decorated with a stupendous series of paintings by Tintoretto and set in the most opulent decoration, which is by far one of the great decorative cycles of any period, anywhere. And this would have been the room in which the concert was held. We know from the testimony of visitors to the city, including Thomas Coriat, who is a very early, 1608, he visits Venice, an Englishman. Some use him as the first grand tourist, and he describes a concert some 3 hours long and with over 20 instrumentalists and a large choir. And even though he's from London, he is completely astounded by the quality of the music. We know that the Venetian Scuole, the confraternities, would vie with each other to create the most stupendous concerts, and particularly on whatever saint's day the confraternity was devoted to. Saint Roche had long been dear to Venetians because he was invoked at times of plague. The city had been devastated by successive bouts of the disease since its first appearance in 1348, and even well into the 18th century, Venetians lived with the fear that it might return at any time. It was not understood that fleas were the means of transmission, and of course the city's extensive maritime trade, even into the 18th century, imported infected rats and people. The close, wet living conditions in the city only encouraged the spread of the disease, especially among the poor. And while the government learned to use containment, conveniently provided by the many small islands of the lagoon, everyone understood that it really could not be truly controlled. By the time Canaletto made his painting, about 1735, a century had passed since the last major epidemic in Venice. Nonetheless, he and his contemporaries surely remembered the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720, which killed over 100,000 people in the city and the surrounding area, and which they could not have known was the last significant outbreak in Europe. Some attributed the sickness to vapors emanating from deep within the earth, but for the faithful, it represented God's wrath for the wickedness of humanity, and they turned to Saint Roche to intercede on their behalf. Roche was born in Montpellier in the first half of the 14th century and became associated with the plague on a pilgrimage to Italy. Encountering the disease, he cared for victims and demonstrated extraordinary healing powers. This is a painting by Tintoretto in the church of Saint Roche, showing the saint attending to those afflicted by the plague. Eventually, he became infected at Piacenza and withdrew to the wilderness, where he was healed by a dog who showed up and brought him food and licked his wounds, healing them. Later, Roche died in Voghera, and by the end of the 14th century, he was revered for his powers against the plague. The Scuola di San Rocco was founded during the epidemic of 1478 by a group of prominent families to perform acts of Christian charity in aid of the poor, especially caring for the sick and burying the dead. And in the aftermath of this severe outbreak, it must have seemed imperative to them to take extraordinary measures, and the body of the saint was simply stolen from its resting place in Voghera and taken to Venice. It was received in 1485 with great ceremony by the Doge and the city, and the confraternity accepted the responsibility of building a church to house the relics, which was consecrated in 1508. The Scuola's headquarters here were begun in 1515 and finished in 1560. There were several Venetian architects involved, but this beautiful scenographic facade is mostly the work of Antonio Scarpagnino. The church depicted by Canaletto shows the edifice in the process of renovation, initiated in 1725 after the original structure was deemed unsafe. The facade was demolished about 1727, leaving this rough structure exposed. The existing facade by Bernardino Maccaruzzi was not built until the 1760s. Here you see it freshly cleaned. The interior, though much changed, you see in this image. The annual state visit to venerate the relics of St. Roche was instituted after the Great Plague of 1576, which claimed nearly a third of the population, including the aged painter Titian. Processions through the street invoking the saint's protection became a feature of life, and when the disease finally subsided, Roche's intercession was credited with saving the city, and it was at this time that he was declared a patron, and August 16th was made a feast of the Republic. It was not the only occasion in the annual calendar related to the plague. In thanksgiving for the plague of 1576, the one that initiates this ceremony at St. Roche, the Senate built the votive church of Il Redentore, the Redeemer, the Church of the Redeemer, Andrea Palladio's great masterwork on the Giudecca. From its consecration in 1592, the Doge and the Senate would process across a pontoon bridge in July from the Zattere to the Giudecca to attend Mass. It was the third Sunday in July, and the feast is still celebrated with a much more formal pontoon today. You see the width of the Giudecca Canal, and that's the Redentore there. And now we're going to consider the Church of Santa Maria della Salute, where we began. Salute is health, and it was built in thanks to the Virgin for deliverance from the plague of 1730, another plague that claimed almost a third of the population of Venice, by the very great Venetian Baroque architect Baldassare Longhena. The Feast of the Salute is held on the 21st of November, when the church celebrates the presentation of the Virgin in the temple. And similar to the Redentore feast, a pontoon bridge was built across the Grand Canal. That's repeated today at a slightly different spot. This is one of the prints. I showed you two of the drawings by Canaletto of the Ascension Day ceremonies. And this is one of the prints from that series that shows the Doge arriving at the Church of the Salute on the 21st of November. And here you can see the bridge as it was constructed in those times with boats wrapped together to create this great pontoon bridge across the canal. We see in this painting the dignitaries processing out of the church beneath an awning that has been very simply erected with poles and a great length of canvas, a really elegant compositional device for Canaletto. Near the head of the procession, but not leading it, is the Doge. There we go, under his ceremonial umbrella. The ceremonial umbrella is then quickly followed. You can see it pointing up right there, the great sword of state behind the Doge, and immediately preceding the Doge in scarlet robes is the Grand Chancellor of the Republic, not a noble, a member of one of the families who had long served in the Venetian bureaucracy. He was the head of the Venetian bureaucracy and was given this position just immediately preceding the Doge to honor him. This was one way in which Venice showed the broad social representation in its government. I told you before that we really don't think that this represents a specific Doge. The Doge at the time that this was painted, we can date this painting only based on style, but it does seem to come from the mid-1730s. And I'm showing you here a portrait by a Venetian painter, Bartolomeo Nazzari, in this awful illustration, I apologize for that, showing Doge Alvise Pisani. It's from the Accademia dei Concordi in Rovigo. And he reigned from 1735 to 1741. But I don't know that it's really close enough. You would think that if it had been truly intended to represent a specific Doge, that we would be able to recognize him. I'm going to take you a little bit farther ahead in the procession now, because in front of the Grand Chancellor were figures with the Doge's ceremonial throne and cushion. On the Doge's right is the head of the Scuola di San Rocco, and on his left, the most senior of the ambassadors who accompanied the Doge and the Senate in this procession. The men in scarlet that you see exiting the church are senators, and beside them, the men in civil attire are those ambassadors. As you can see, the participants in the procession are carrying nosegays. These were presented as soon as they arrived by the officials of the Scuola, and they represent a means, a remembrance of one of the means of trying to evade being infected with the plague, because people would walk around with the nosegays over their face to try to offer some form of protection, that from this idea that it emanated from vapors in the earth. We also think that the festoons put up for the occasion may represent the kinds of plant material that were used in times of plague as a means of trying to stave it off. The facade of the Scuola, of course, forms a brilliant backdrop for such ceremonial occasions. That was certainly part of its purpose. And Canaletto captures its rich layering of elements, its beautifully sculpted columns and capitals, its colorful marble inlay, and the heavy leaded glass windows. We don't want you to get too close to the painting, but you don't have to, really. You can do it from a good yard away, but you will find wherever there is a circle in the painting, you'll find a little point of a compass, and if you look very closely, it rules, where it was very, very carefully prepared by the artist before he started to paint. People have gathered on both sides of the procession to watch, and Canaletto endows each of them with a distinct identity. This is one of the aspects that makes Canaletto such a great view painter, is the human element in his paintings. Off in one corner, you can see two men, one giving directions to the other. There are merchants here who have had to pause. They're not going to sell anything. There's one with scales. Their wares down below. And two men in turbans from the east. Now, the Feast of St. Roche was especially significant for painters because it was the occasion for the only fixed annual art exhibition in 18th century Venice, a kind of precursor to the Biennale, although, as you can see, a much more informal one. Canaletto shows framed and unframed canvases hanging from the facade of the Scuola and the adjacent houses. To modern exhibition visitors, this manner of presentation seems highly informal, virtually impromptu, and to some extent it must have been. Unfortunately, we don't know much about how the shows were organized, but to judge from this, we have to think that they were far more ad hoc affairs than the Paris salons, which by this date had a system of submissions, a catalog, and criticism. Nonetheless, the San Rocco show was a real art event in its day, and it's the recurrent nature of that exhibition that makes it special in Venice. Sometimes painters would have impromptu shows of works about to be dispatched to foreign countries. They'd set them up in the Piazza San Marco or wherever for people to see. But this was only sporadic. Occasionally during the Festa della Sensa, exhibitions would be organized, but this, again, is actually fairly rare. The origins of this art exhibition are unclear. Images of the saint or the like were often put up on the facades of such buildings on a saint's feast day, but this was different, and it had a real commercial purpose. Such exhibitions were not unique to Venice and were often held, much more often held, on the Feast of Corpus Christi in Florence, Bologna, and other cities. The event taking place in this site and on St. Roche's Day underscored the rich history of the Scuola in the patronage of the arts, and particularly the art of painting. And surely the summer weather and light were also surely factors in its success, as was the relatively small size of the square. Canaletto illustrates virtually every genre of painting practiced in Venice: historical works, portraits, genre paintings, landscapes, and views of the city. This one hanging at the far right, we're going to zoom in right there, could represent a work by Canaletto. But as you can see, this is about the size of a postage stamp. And so when you see it blown up, you can see that they are only vague evocations of style. And the painting has, the closest anyone has gotten is one of the works here, seems to reflect, perhaps in reverse, this great composition by Johann Lies, a German painter who came and settled in Venice and died very, very young in the plague of 1630. But as you see, it's very different as well, the angel being given great wings and the like. And so Canaletto seems to be very deliberately creating just a feeling for these types of paintings rather than for trying to be at all specific. I should say, with regard to Canaletto, that as he was beginning his career, 10 years before painting this work, in 1725, he showed a view on this occasion, and it was noticed by the imperial ambassador, the ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor, the German Holy Roman Emperor, and this helped launch Canaletto's career. And indeed, we know that all of the major painters of Venice in the 18th century really got their starts here. Some of them show later in their careers when they're already established, famous artists. We also know that occasionally old masters were shown as well. And so it was a real hodgepodge, but also a great celebration of the art of painting in the city. This painting was first recorded in 1802 in a London auction, and we don't know why or for whom it was made. In that London auction, it was said to come from the Vatican, but there's no trace of it there. People have looked, and that may be just simply spurious. It's very difficult to imagine why a Briton would have wanted this unless there was some devotion to St. Roche or simply they were attracted to this subject, but it's also difficult to imagine that Canaletto would have painted it on spec. And so it's a bit of a mystery who would have wanted this representation of the piety of the Republic being expressed. The subject of the Bucintoro and the Regatta, of course, could appeal very much to British visitors on the Grand Tour. They were Britain was also a maritime nation and one that respected shipbuilding techniques and the like. And many Britons looked to Venice, particularly members of the Whig Party, the Liberals, looked to Venice as an ideal form of government. An oligarchy in which the head of state is elected, not gaining power through hereditary rights, to be head of state. In the end, it's also possible that some people simply wanted festive pictures for their walls. It's difficult to say at this point in time, and unfortunately, not much got written down by these patrons, and it's going to take a bit of study to try to determine if there are real patterns here. Let it suffice to say that these, in their own way, did the job, extended the job of the ceremonies, that is, as demonstrations of the greatness of the Republic. And of course, we value them hugely as evoking this wonderful culture, now long gone. The one thing I haven't addressed with you today is music. And one is hard-pressed to find musicians in Canaletto's compositions. Now, in this case, one can imagine that this may be artistic license that they're omitted here, but also one can imagine that such a procession out of the church, they would not have wanted the sackbuts and trumpets of the Doge, but rather to have this procession bathed in music emanating from the church, thereby sanctifying the procession and its expression of the city's desire for good health. I just wanted to show you in the end, Canaletto's painting is a rather miraculous thing, because that piazza is not very wide. In point of fact, you could not possibly take in Canaletto's view. It is a wonderful example of what the art of view painting does and what photography cannot. And let's end up where we left off, with Bruce and Monet. When Bruce sent this to me, I thought to myself, well, yes, in its quasi-photographic aspects, Canaletto relates. But then I realized after a while, what Bruce really must have had in the back of his head was something much more recent. This work by Monet from 1908. And of course, images of the city continue long after the Serenissima is gone, but in a different sense, in a post-romantic sense, in which an artist's feeling for a place begins to dominate and no longer take in that precise view of the city that Canaletto sought for himself and for his patrons. I urge you to savor these wonderful works while we have the chance, and do come back and visit the exhibition many, many times. And I'd be happy to take questions now. Yes, Bruce.
There's always a large boat with striped.
Yes.
And
now let me see if I can get back to it.
Yeah, and I'm wondering about its function, and it's not in some of the views, but it's certainly in Carlavara's.
Forgive me, folks. I give up trying to do it the other way. We need to go back really almost to the beginning. Bruce is speaking. Here we are back with the first signed and dated view of Venice. Bruce is speaking of this vessel with its striped awning, which you also see here in the Carlavaris. And to my knowledge, the only time that it was moved away from the Civic Center was for the Marriage of the Sea ceremony. And it's nothing grand. It's a prison barge. It was where prisoners were held awaiting sentencing in the courts of the Doge's palace, and it's called the fusta. Anyone else? Yes, Kent.
Yeah, we'll see it in just a second here. Right there. Yeah, that'll do.
Thank you, Kent. You're leading me.
The back side,
I didn't mention it.
the back side of the tower, right?
Yes, very ragged. Canaletto's works are difficult to date. One can get them by decade and the like. There is evolution in his art, but to specifically date, they're very tough. He almost never dates them. And in this case, we can be very specific. Because that ragged edge resulted from a lightning strike that softened the mortar of the bricks and caused many of them to fall. It took place in 1745 and was naturally quickly repaired. Canaletto leaves for England in March of 1746, and so we can date this work very precisely. And either it amused Canaletto, or some visitor wanted it to look the way it looked when they saw it.
So,
Yes.
yes, I would like to know how the artist prepared to do a painting of those scenes like that, since they couldn't take a picture or anything.
Indeed. Scholars still debate the use of the camera obscura, a camera that enabled an artist to trace an image on a glass plate. And there is one shown in Venice, a camera obscura with a little plaque saying it was Canaletto's. I think most people agree it's a later camera obscura and that it probably was never used by Canaletto. I find it very difficult to imagine that he didn't use it. It was available, and it would aid in the study of buildings. However, one should not think that he simply places the camera, does a tracing, and goes back to the studio and enlarges it. This is not how it worked. It would have been used to study specific aspects, specific buildings. And you have to imagine, in the case of this painting, him doing his work on a bobbing boat. And so you have to treat this very, very judiciously. We know there are a few drawings that were perhaps had their starts in tracings with a camera obscura, but most of Canaletto's drawings show he simply had an extraordinary facility and would then go back and plan the works very carefully in the studio according to the laws of perspective of the like, and not the rigorous use of perspective, a very creative use of perspective. Let me go back just a little bit here. Bruce, when is the first balloon ascent? It's into the 19th century, isn't it? 1892, 1792, sorry. So you have to imagine this is 1738, 39 or thereabouts, and so this is long before the first ascent in a balloon, and he's up. He's up quite a bit in creating this work. So one could imagine him using it, for instance, to study San Giorgio Maggiore, although again, from where? A bobbing boat? We don't know is the real answer as to how he used it, but I find it difficult to imagine that he didn't, that he wouldn't have had this tool and made use of it. I think you just need to be careful because as in this case, even if he were able to get up to this height, he would not have seen this. He would not have seen San Giorgio Maggiore on that angle relative to the Doge's palace, or in scale, for that matter, to the Doge's palace if you start looking very, very hard. This is simply a composed picture, something that's put together, knitted together very deftly by an artist. Yes?
Speaking of which, there is in the exhibition a sketch or an etching that really looks like an aerial view of the city and with tremendous detail as to the location of each and every building, and I'm wondering how that was done.
It was also done with the perspectival arts. You're talking about not a work of art in the exhibition, rather the blow-up that we've done of the map of Matthäus Mariam from about 1635. The original print is about that size, and we've blown it up to the size you see on the screen here. And it was also a matter of very, very detailed observation and then projection using the arts of perspective. Yes?
You mentioned the consternation that came about when they asked for fundraising in 2008. It occurred to me that right around that same time, they were also raising funds for the restoration of La Fenice, the opera house that has burned down. Is there any relationship, or am I throwing you a curve in asking?
No, you're not throwing me a curve at all. There was great support for the restoration of La Fenice, and of course for opera lovers all over the world, it was a cause. The Fondazione Bucintoro is supported by businessmen in the region, but it's rather difficult to know how they're going to quite raise 20 million euros. That's a lot of money, and I wish them the best. But the two aren't connected as far as I know. Yes?
Wasn't the Archbishophood of San Rocco considered Tintoretto's Sistine Chapel, and wasn't he paid practically nothing to do it?
Well, no, not entirely. I mean, artists always would like to have gotten a bit more, and his relationship with the Scuola was certainly one he wanted to see this through. He knew what it would mean to his everlasting reputation, and perhaps he deserved a bit more. But it was a relationship that went on for about 3 decades. And for those of you who don't know it, it's really not optional when you go to Venice. It's a must-do. It's one of those things that until you experience it, you can't quite fathom. Just going through a book and looking at the illustrations doesn't quite do it. It's one of the great things. One more? Here you go.
So we've seen that most of these works, or at least a number of works, or how the example of how there's so many Canalettos in Britain, for example, and we've seen a lot in the U.S., but particularly how many of those were done for British patrons. But I'm wondering, given the nature of his style, the mimetic aspect of it, and how with regard to the academic tradition in the 18th century, how, with regard to the hierarchy of genres, how was his painting received by Venetians or Italian artists?
I failed to tell you something essential, and that is that Venetians didn't buy this stuff. It just didn't happen. The works by Canaletto that you find in Venice today have come back to Venice in the 20th century. They weren't works bought by Venetians. That's why the Scuola di San Rocco pictures is so mysterious. Who would have wanted this? What outsider would have wanted this kind of painting? Foreign residents of Venice commissioned works like this from Canaletto, but Venetians themselves, no, almost not at all, unlike the works of Pietro Longhi, who's the lovely painter of Venetian life and manners in the 18th century. We have 4 of his works in the exhibition. Those works were bought almost exclusively by Venetians. They adored them. But of course, they could walk outside and see this every day. It was part and parcel of the town. And now, I think they would love to have a few more come back to the city. But they weren't things that were patronized in the time. Regarding the hierarchy of genres, there is no accident that the British, more than any others, and they were not Canaletto's only buyers, but they were hugely in the majority among those buyers. It appealed to their scientific interests and supported them. But in terms of the hierarchy of the arts, this is really a kind of painting that's down below landscape painting because it is mimetic, because it seems to represent reality. Therefore, the idealism of art and the like is pushed to the background. We did a show in London a few years ago called Canaletto and His Rivals, that the British know Canaletto better than anyone. Of course, he came, he lived, and he worked there for 10 years. I didn't show you any, but scenes such as this prepared him well for doing the scenes involving the Thames. But Britons don't know the numerous other view painters of Venice. And so we set up this show with its spine being Canaletto's career, and then plugging in all of his rivals along the way to show how view painting evolved in the course of the 18th century. I've forgotten where I was going, sorry. Where was I going? I know where I was going. And I wanted to make the point that it was not a show that I particularly wanted to do. Being the curator of a great collection of his works in London, I know him better than most, but there are real specialists in this kind of painting, and they tend to be dealers because this kind of work is so commercially popular even still. And we took a lot of flack for this. The great expert in the field of Canaletto, at least today, is Charles Beddington, who is a London dealer, and he knows it better than anyone. And we had him do the catalog. I did most of the setup of the show and a lot of the negotiations, but he did the catalog, and we took a lot of flack. And one of the things that I told a journalist in the wake of this flack was, go out and find me an academic or a museum curator who's an equal expert in this field. They don't exist. And they don't exist because they couldn't get jobs in this world. They couldn't. It's something very, very specific. And because of its mimetic aspects, it's looked down on in the academic hierarchy.
So is that true in his time as well?
No, yes. The academic hierarchy of history painting, the great paintings from the Bible and classical mythology at the top, down. But because of the empiricism involved here, it was not quite to the same extent. These paintings offered they didn't have photography, and so for certain people, at least, they had great appeal and value. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon.